The amount of money needed for UN humanitarian appeals involving extreme weather events like floods or drought is now 8 times higher than 20 years ago. According to a new Oxfam report, footing the bill for every $2 that's needed for UN weather-related appeals, donor countries are only providing $1. Rich countries responsible for most of today's climate change impacts have met only an estimated 54% of these appeals since 2017, leaving a shortfall of up to $33 billion. The increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events due to climate change is putting more pressure on an already overstretched and underfunded humanitarian system. For a little bit more on this report, we're now joined by Russell Armstrong, who's a Senior Climate Policy Advisor for Oxfam America. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. This report reveals quite an alarming shift, drop in donors and the help that countries previously gave. Have you been able to figure out why?
Yes, thank you for having us on, and I appreciate the time to talk about our reports. First, one thing I want to highlight is that the drop in humanitarian appeals, or the increase in humanitarian appeals and the drop in shortfalls in funding is really more of the canary in the coal mine. Part of the reason that Oxfam conducted this report and this research, along with other organizations such as Climate Action Network, was to show that there is humanitarian funding and development assistance is important, but simply just not enough and not equipped to handle the increase in extreme weather events that are frankly happening all over the globe and in both now rich and poor countries. And so the takeaway, while it's seen as 8 times higher now in just the last 20 years, what we really want folks to take away is that humanitarian assistance is simply not equipped for this, and that we need both new and additional funding in the form of to address loss and damage from extreme weather and climate-related events, particularly in addition to adaptation funding.
I'm pretty sure all of these countries recognize the issues, recognize the importance. What's shifting in terms of why they can't or won't support in the way that they used to? Is it there's just many other issues, or what is it?
Well, it's not even that they won't support. So for funding for loss and damages, frankly, hasn't happened before. The humanitarian support humanitarian appeals are increasing at an unprecedented rate and can't keep up. One of the things that the report notes is that as you mentioned, that there's only 54% funded on average, but even worse is to note that the real shortfall in terms of extreme weather events to the actual amount funded is the number of people covered, that only 400 million people are actually covered by these humanitarian appeals, while nearly 4 billion people across the planet have actually experienced extreme related weather.
And nobody is free from extreme weather-related events. Even in the most developed nations with the deepest pockets, this is happening. So one would think that you'd recognize it, especially when it's right on your front doorstep, that this is an urgent and global issue.
You would, and actually, I would say that's the impetus, hopefully, for change. Right now, as we have diplomats and ministers meeting in Germany to discuss climate change throughout the month and leading up to COP27 this November, it seems that the time is now that finally rich nations, along with developing nations, are starting to see the impacts of climate change and are ready to address some of these issues. However, the concern is that they will only address issues within their borders. And as you've noted, the extreme shortfalls in both humanitarian appeals and the need for additional adaptation and loss and damage funding is critical. And those both need to be increased to meet the need now. And I just want to point out that in addition, countries across, for example, the continent of Africa are only responsible for 4% of global emissions. And so this is a global problem that now that it's reached the doorsteps of rich nations, hopefully they see the benefit of addressing it now versus kicking the can further down the road, where costs may go from, on average, maybe 30 billion a year is estimated, to within this decade reaching almost 300 billion a year to address the loss of community, culture, and frankly, lives due to climate change.
Is there an argument then maybe to changing the focus of the appeal to, instead of responding to what's happened, to start to say, let's take preventative action, let's take action ahead of time? Might that help, or are we dealing with the same mentality?
I think there's arguments for money to flow to nations that need it through multiple channels. There's no one necessarily answer. While we're calling for a new finance facility in this paper, there are arguments from other countries that we should be using existing finance mechanisms to fund and support adaptation and loss and damage funding. And I think that these are the solutions that should be being debated by world leaders when it comes to climate change, whether it's the Glasgow dialogues or else, and being more forward-looking, whether it's adaptation funding to solve for drought-resistant crops, to provide for ways to shore up seawalls, and addressing the changes to life that people are realizing and dealing with across the globe, but most acutely in the nations least likely to have emitted harmful greenhouse gas emissions.
Are there enough funds out there?
It's a great question, whether there's enough money out there to address the crisis. Looking at the different sources of funding and for becoming creative about those different sources of funding, I think that there are ways to identify that money, whether we're looking at innovative new sources of financing from corporate polluters, whether we're looking at other nations actually paying in their fair share. For example, using my own country in the US, we have doubled our commitment to mitigation and adaptation funding, so committing to a pledge of 11.4 billion, but even that falls short of the estimated amount needed for adaptation funding that we should be contributing to the globe. So regardless of the calculation used, there are ways to find the money to do this. It's just that there needs to be the will to solve this crisis as well.
Give us a sense, if you can, of just how much these weather-related events are costing. I don't know what the last figures that you had, just to give us a sense of the enormity of the problem.
Sure. So, as you mentioned, the enormity of the problem is escalated. We've gone from up to $30 billion a year in loss and damages now is estimated, and that could rise easily to 300 billion by 2030. And when I say loss and damage, we're talking about addressing loss and damage from climate effects, from climate change issues that are impacting families and communities. Small island developing nations are concerned that if we're on track with our current nationally determined contributions from the Paris Agreement now, they may not exist by the end of not even the end of the century, but possibly by 2050 because of issues with rising sea level and increasing power of storms and typhoons across the world.
So when you arrive at the various COP gatherings and you as Oxfam present reports like this, what is said there?
Well, we preach to the ministers and the leaders that need to hear it. And we join in solidarity with the youth movement that's bringing new energy to this and saying that the climate change is happening across the world and that money needs to be addressed to this now. We need to think about ways to equitably and justly transition from fossil fuels. We need to think about ways to ensure that people from that equitable representation is on the boards of these decision-making financial institutions that are providing funding to make sure that the money is flowing to the places that need it the most, and that we need to make sure that polluters, the historic and current highest polluting countries are committing real dollars to solving these issues before they further spread across the world.
So the problem with this whole equation often is that the greatest polluters are the ones that are responsible for the greatest consequences being felt in other parts of the world, the developing nations, for example. I wonder if there isn't maybe a way to say maybe they need to be forced to pay. I don't know, something beyond a carbon tax or something to compensate for their pollution. Because if I'm Mozambique and I'm suffering an extreme weather event, I need much more help, but I don't have the money. But the polluters who created the problem are not next door. They're mostly in the developed nations.
You're right. The polluters are not next door, and there needs to be ways to hold the polluters accountable. And that's the purpose of having these stronger international mechanisms, by making sure that we address these issues and having the UN agreements codify these pieces and codify that loss and damage is something that needs to be addressed, that climate change is part of this, that the solutions need to include solutions from communities, both based off of gender and based off of historical impacts that they've faced. And we think that's part of the solution. Going through litigation may help in short-term solutions, and like we're in support of partners and working through those solutions, but it's not long-term. Long-term, it's going to require a global effort, and that global effort can't just be from forced action. It has to be voluntary, and it has to be a sustained and predictable commitment.
Russell, we'll leave it there. Thank you very, very much indeed for joining us and giving us some of the highlights of this very important report. And it is available on your website, isn't it? People can refer to it.
Absolutely. They can read it and the press release as well.
All right, fantastic. Russell Armstrong, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.